Kelly walked hand in hand with her 6-year-old son Ben as they entered the local children's center. The walls were painted in bright, cheerful colors, and children's artwork hung everywhere, creating a warm and welcoming atmosphere. The sound of kids laughing and playing filled the air, and Ben's eyes lit up as he saw the play structures and the group of kids already busy with their activities. "Can I go play, Mommy?" Ben asked eagerly, his bright red hair bouncing as he looked up at her with his freckled face full of excitement. "Of course, sweetie," Kelly said with a smile, letting go of his hand. "Just stay where I can see you." Ben darted off to join his friends, his laughter mixing with the sounds of the other children. Kelly found a comfortable spot to sit where she could keep an eye on him while she relaxed with a book. She loved these moments, watching Ben thrive in such a positive environment. He was a happy, energetic boy, and the children's center was one of his favorite places to be. As Kelly settled into her seat, she noticed a woman standing at the far end of the room. The woman was in her mid-40s, with short blonde hair and a serious expression. She was watching Kelly and Ben closely, her eyes narrowing slightly as she observed them. At first, Kelly tried to ignore it. She was used to the occasional curious glance. After all, it wasn't every day that people saw a black mother with a white child. But as time passed, Kelly began to feel uncomfortable. The woman's expression had shifted from curiosity to something more like suspicion. She wasn't just looking at them, she was scrutinizing them. Kelly turned her attention back to her book, trying to focus on the words, but she could still feel the woman's eyes on her. It made her uneasy, and she couldn't help but wonder what the woman was thinking. After a few more minutes, the woman started walking towards her. Kelly looked up, trying to prepare herself for whatever was coming. The woman stopped in front of her, her arms crossed, and her gaze intense. "Excuse me," the woman said, her tone cold and accusatory. "Is that boy yours?" Kelly felt her heart skip a beat, but she kept her voice calm. "Yes, he's my son," she replied, giving the woman a polite smile. The woman raised an eyebrow, clearly not convinced. "Are you his nanny or something?" "No," Kelly said, still trying to stay calm. "I'm his mother." The woman's eyes narrowed further, and her voice grew sharper. "That's impossible. He doesn't look anything like you. Where are his real parents?" Kelly felt a surge of anger and hurt, but she pushed it down. She didn't want to make a scene, especially not in front of Ben. "I adopted Ben when he was a baby," she explained, hoping that would satisfy the woman. "I'm his legal mother." But the woman shook her head, her suspicion only deepening. "I don't believe you," she said, her voice growing louder. "This doesn't add up. I think you've taken this child, and I'm going to call the police." Kelly's heart raced as she looked over at Ben, who was still playing happily, unaware of the confrontation unfolding nearby. The last thing she wanted was to scare him, but the woman was becoming more aggressive, and other parents were starting to watch. "Please, there's no need for that," Kelly said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Ben is my son, and I love him very much. You're making a mistake." But the woman had already pulled out her phone, her fingers quickly dialing 911. "We'll see what the police have to say about this," she said, her tone filled with certainty. "I'm not going to let you get away with this." Kelly felt a wave of fear and helplessness wash over her. How did a simple day at the children's center turn into this nightmare? She glanced over at Ben again, praying that the police would see the truth and that this would all be over soon. But deep down, Kelly knew that things could go very wrong. She needed to stay calm and protect her son, no matter what. As the woman spoke to the 911 operator, Kelly braced herself for what was to come, hoping that everything would be okay in the end. Kelly's heart pounded in her chest as she watched the woman speak into her phone, loudly describing the situation to the police. The other parents in the children's center were now staring openly, their expressions a mix of curiosity, concern, and judgment. Kelly could feel their eyes on her, making her feel more isolated with each passing second. She glanced over at Ben, who was still playing, blissfully unaware of the turmoil unfolding just a few feet away. But as the woman's voice grew louder and more agitated, Ben looked up, sensing the tension in the room. He saw Kelly standing there, her face pale and her hands clenched at her sides, and immediately knew something was wrong. "Mommy," Ben called out as he started walking over to her. "What's happening?" Kelly forced a smile, kneeling down to Ben's level and pulling him close. She stroked his hair gently, trying to hide the fear in her voice. "Everything's okay, sweetie," she said softly. "There's just been a little misunderstanding, but it's going to be all right." Ben looked up at her with wide eyes, his small hand clutching hers tightly. "Are we in trouble?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. "No, we're not in trouble," Kelly assured him, though inside she was deeply worried about what would happen when the police arrived. "Just stay close to me, okay?" As if on cue, the sound of police sirens grew louder outside the center. Kelly's stomach dropped as two uniformed officers walked in, their expressions serious. The woman who had called them immediately pointed in Kelly's direction, her voice loud and accusing. "There she is," the woman exclaimed, gesturing toward Kelly and Ben. "That black woman has a white boy with her, and she claims he's her son. But he's not. I'm sure she's taken him." The officers quickly assessed the situation and approached Kelly, who was holding Ben's hand tightly. "Ma'am, we need to speak with you," one of the officers said, his tone professional but firm. "We received a call about a possible abduction. Can you please explain what's going on?" Kelly's throat felt dry as she looked into the officer's eyes. She knew she had nothing to hide, but the weight of the situation made it hard to find her voice. She squeezed Ben's hand, drawing strength from his presence, and began to speak. "This is my son Ben," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I adopted him when he was a baby. His biological parents were very close friends of mine, but they passed away in a car accident when Ben was just a few months old. I promised them that if anything ever happened to them, I would take care of Ben as my own, and I've kept that promise." As she spoke, Kelly's voice wavered, but she pressed on. "I've raised Ben since he was an infant. He's my son in every way that matters. We came here today just to play, like we do every week." The officers listened carefully, their expressions softening as they heard Kelly's story. They could see the love and protectiveness in her eyes, and it was clear that she was telling the truth. Ben, still holding tightly to Kelly's hand, looked up at her with a mixture of confusion and trust, not fully understanding what was happening, but knowing that he was safe with his mom. The woman who had called the police stood nearby, her arms crossed, but her expression was beginning to change. She no longer looked so sure of herself. As Kelly spoke, the truth of the situation began to sink in, and a look of disbelief and embarrassment crossed the woman's face. The second officer, who had been quietly observing, stepped forward. "Ma'am, do you have any identification or documents that can confirm what you've told us?" he asked gently. Kelly nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she reached into her bag. She pulled out her driver's license and a folder containing Ben's adoption papers and handed them to the officer. "These should prove everything," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. The officers reviewed the documents carefully, and as they did, the tension in the room began to ease. It was clear that Kelly was telling the truth, and the officer's demeanor softened even further. The first officer looked up from the papers and nodded at Kelly. "Thank you, ma'am. Everything appears to be in order here." He then turned to the woman who had called them, his expression stern. "It seems there has been a misunderstanding. This woman is, in fact, Ben's legal guardian and mother. There's no abduction here." The woman's face turned red with embarrassment, and she stammered as she tried to find her words. I just thought, I didn't know." Kelly could see the regret starting to form in the woman's eyes, but the damage had already been done. The fear, the humiliation, those couldn't be undone so easily. But as she looked down at Ben, who was still holding on to her hand, Kelly knew she needed to stay strong for him. The officers, now satisfied that everything was resolved, handed Kelly back her documents and offered her an apology. "We're sorry for the trouble, ma'am," one of them said kindly. "You did nothing wrong. If there's anything else we can do for you, please let us know." Kelly shook her head, trying to smile through the lingering anxiety. "No, thank you. I just want to take my son home." With that, the officers left the center, leaving Kelly and Ben standing there. The other parents, who had been watching from a distance, quickly turned away, embarrassed that they had assumed the worst. The woman who had called the police stood there, still stunned by the reality of the situation, realizing just how wrong she had been. Kelly took a deep breath, feeling a wave of relief wash over her, but also a deep sadness for what had just happened. She knew this was an experience that neither she nor Ben would forget anytime soon. But for now, they just needed to get home, where they could feel safe again. Kelly watched as the officers carefully reviewed the documents she had handed them. She could feel Ben's small hand trembling in hers, and when she looked down at him, his eyes were wide with fear and confusion. His innocent trust in the world had been shaken, and it broke Kelly's heart to see him like this. "Mommy, why are they doing this?" Ben asked in a small, trembling voice. He looked up at her, seeking the comfort and reassurance only she could give. Kelly knelt down beside him, pulling him close in a protective hug. "It's okay, sweetie," she whispered softly, stroking his hair. "There was a mistake, but everything is going to be all right. The police just need to make sure everything is in order. We'll go home soon." Ben clung to her, his face buried in her shoulder. "I don't like this," he mumbled, his voice muffled by her jacket. "I know, baby," Kelly said, kissing the top of his head. "I don't like it either, but we're almost done here. I promise." As Kelly comforted Ben, one of the officers finished looking through the adoption papers and glanced over at the other officer, giving a small nod. It was clear that everything checked out. The second officer, who had been holding the photo of Kelly and Ben from when he was a baby, handed it back to her with a gentle smile. "Ma'am, everything is in order here," the officer said kindly. "We're sorry for the inconvenience, but we needed to follow up on the call. You've been very cooperative, and we appreciate that." Kelly took the documents back, feeling a mix of relief and lingering anger. "Thank you," she said quietly, holding Ben close as she stood up. "I understand you were just doing your job." The officer nodded sympathetically. "We're glad everything is okay. You're free to go, ma'am. If there's anything else we can do for you, please let us know." Before Kelly could respond, the woman who had made the call stepped forward, her face flushed with embarrassment and regret. She opened her mouth to speak, but for a moment, no words came out. She looked at Kelly, then at Ben, her expression a mix of guilt and shame as the reality of her mistake hit her. I'm so sorry," the woman stammered, her voice shaking. "I didn't know. I thought I was just trying to protect him. I didn't mean to cause so much trouble." Kelly looked at the woman, her eyes calm but filled with the hurt of the experience. She could see the regret in the woman's eyes, but the damage had already been done. The fear and humiliation that she and Ben had just endured couldn't be erased by a simple apology. But Kelly knew she needed to stay strong, especially for Ben, who was still holding onto her like she was his lifeline. "It's not easy being a mom," Kelly said quietly, her voice steady but tinged with sadness. "But you made an assumption about us without knowing the full story. Families don't always look the way people expect them to, but that doesn't make them any less real." The woman nodded, her eyes welling up with tears. "I know, I'm so sorry," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to hurt you or your son. I wasn't thinking." Kelly took a deep breath, trying to find the strength to respond. She could feel the tension in her shoulders start to ease as she accepted that the woman was truly sorry. But that didn't make it any easier to forgive what had happened. "I appreciate your apology," Kelly said finally, her voice soft but firm. "But please, next time, think before you act. This was a very scary situation for us, and it could have been avoided." The woman nodded again, unable to meet Kelly's gaze. "I will," she promised, her voice cracking slightly. "I really will." The police officers, seeing that the situation was resolved, offered Kelly one last apology. "We're truly sorry for what you went through today, ma'am," one of them said. "We hope you and your son can move on from this." Kelly nodded, her grip on Ben's hand tightening slightly. "Thank you," she replied. "We'll be okay." With that, the officers left the center, leaving Kelly and Ben to process what had just happened. The other parents, who had been watching from a distance, quickly turned away, embarrassed that they had assumed the worst. Kelly could feel their eyes on her, but she no longer cared. All that mattered was that Ben was safe and that they could finally go home. As they walked towards the door, Kelly felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. She knew this experience would stay with them for a long time, but she was determined not to let it define them. They were a family, and nothing would ever change that. "Mommy, can we go home now?" Ben asked, his voice still small but filled with trust. Kelly looked down at him and smiled, her heart swelling with love. "Yes, sweetie," she said gently. "Let's go home." As Kelly and Ben were getting ready to leave the children's center, the woman who had called the police hesitantly approached them. Kelly could see the remorse written all over her face. The woman looked nervous, almost as if she wasn't sure if she should say anything, but after a moment, she gathered her courage and spoke. "Excuse me," the woman said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. "Could I speak with you for a moment? I know I've already apologized, but I feel like I need to say more." Kelly looked at Ben, who was standing close to her, still holding her hand. She didn't really want to talk to the woman any further, but something in the woman's voice made her pause. She nodded slowly and turned to Ben. "Sweetie, can you go play with your friends for a few more minutes? I'll be right here." Ben hesitated, looking between Kelly and the woman, but finally nodded and headed back towards the play area. Kelly watched him go, her heart still heavy with the events of the day. The woman took a deep breath before speaking again. "I just wanted to say how truly sorry I am for what happened. I let my own biases and assumptions get in the way, and I judged you without knowing anything about your situation. I've realized how wrong I was, and I'm so sorry for the pain I caused you and your son." Kelly listened quietly, her emotions still raw. She could hear the sincerity in the woman's voice, and though it didn't erase what had happened, it did soften the sting a little. The woman continued, her voice filled with regret. "I know I can't take back what I did, but if there's any way I can make amends, please let me know. I've been thinking a lot about my actions, and I want to do better. I want to learn how to be more understanding, more accepting." Kelly looked at the woman, seeing the vulnerability in her eyes. She knew the woman's actions had come from a place of ignorance, but she also recognized the genuine desire to change. This was an opportunity to turn the painful experience into something positive. "Thank you for your apology," Kelly said gently. "What you did hurt me and my son deeply, but I can see that you truly regret it. Families come in all shapes, sizes, and colors, and it's important to remember that appearances don't define love or family. We need to move past our assumptions and start seeing people for who they really are." The woman nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "You're right. I have a lot to learn, and I'm grateful that you're willing to talk to me about it." Kelly felt a sense of relief wash over her. It wasn't easy to relive the pain, but if it meant helping someone understand, it was worth it. I hope that in the future, you'll think twice before judging someone based on how they look. We all have the power to create a more understanding world if we're willing to open our hearts and minds.